You're listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika.
What does it feel like to be lonely? It feels like being hungry when everyone around you is readying for a feast. It feels shameful and alarming. And over time, these feelings radiate outwards, making the lonely person increasingly isolated, increasingly estranged. Now, it might seem a little bit odd to begin this new year with Olivia Lang's quote from The Lonely City, and maybe even to begin this podcast with this seemingly heavy topic of loneliness. Because commercially right now, all of December and January is this huge celebration. We're constantly surrounded by these barrage of images where everyone's smiling, everyone's happy, they're exchanging gifts, smiling, eating together, and everyone looks like they're cocooned in absolute security and comfort right now. But I think the truth is that not all of us necessarily relate to these images. And I know that I don't. There are many times when I don't. And the strong narrative of joy around festive seasons can make a lot of us feel, left out and lonely.
Absolutely. And an article written this time last year actually reported on how helplines experience a spike of almost 30% around this time of the year. And a lot of the calls also young people or older people who, like you're saying, just feel out of sync with this idea of perfect happiness that's being projected. And, but the thing is that loneliness isn't just restricted to this part of the year. It is become something that you experience, year long and, day on day. And, so much so that in the UK, they've appointed a loneliness minister now.
Yeah, I read about that.
Yeah. And, in India, we don't really have extensive studies on the prevalence of loneliness. But there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that points to it. And, there's reports by psychologists and counselors. And so much so that India actually is one of the countries which has the highest suicide rate in Southeast Asia. And that was a World Health Organization report published in 2016. And, just all of this points to how loneliness has become a growing concern.
And I think the second point of loneliness being a particularly disturbing phenomenon that's taking place at the societal level is because loneliness is being understood as an important indicator for both psychological and physical well-being of people. And I was reading how, loneliness is supposed to have the same impact on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I mean, yeah, making it even more dangerous than obesity. And so it's a genuine public health concern. So we decided to open our conversation with two lovely women, Sonia Thomas and Sandhya Menon. Both women are living with mental health conditions and have substantial online following where they speak on these issues with deep vulnerability and openness.
I'm Sonia. I am a content creator. I spend my entire life on the internet. I'm 26 and I live in Bombay, and that is pretty much my entire life. I moved to Bombay in 2010. So I've been living in Bombay alone, as in without family, for around 9 years now. I stay on my own. There are no roommates or anyone to share the space with, and that's great. Honestly, I don't mind it. I'm not someone who enjoys socializing much, so I'm okay with living alone, actually.
So Sonia was talking about how she struggled with depression from a very young age, and she was diagnosed with PCOD at 22. And she said actually it was a relief for her when that happened, because for the first time there was a connection between what she was experiencing and her physical symptoms. And and a lot of studies have shown that women with PCOD actually have a higher likelihood of anxiety and depression.
Absolutely. And I think I'm seeing this occur in more and more women around me. PCOD is becoming shockingly common. Well, in Sandhya's case, like Sonia, she used to live in Mumbai, and I think she misses it very, very much because it came up in our conversation a lot. But personal circumstances made her shift to Bangalore a couple of years back.
I'm Sandhya Menon, and I'm a journalist. I was a journalist for about 15 years, and after that I've been doing freelance writing for about 2-3 years now. I'm a single mom. I live in Bangalore. I live with my children. They're 10 and 11 years old, and I also work among the other things that I do apart from professionally. I paint, I crochet. So I moved to Bangalore about 7 years ago. 2012, I think, is when I moved. I think, yeah. Late, end of 2012. I came to Bangalore because funny set of circumstances. I was diagnosed. I had a what would I think be termed as a breakdown, a proper breakdown of all sorts of things. And I was diagnosed with a couple of mental illnesses. I couldn't find the strength to go back to work after that. So I moved to Bangalore because my parents owned a house here, and at that point, it was the best option for me to live rent free. So I moved to Bangalore.
So both Sonia and Sandhya, have been navigating and reflecting on their experiences of loneliness in the city. And, when I met Sonia one evening, it was one of the first things we started talking about, where she described what loneliness means to her.
Growing up as an only child teaches you to enjoy your own company. It's almost as if you have no choice. You have to learn to enjoy your own company. So for me, that's always been the case. Loneliness is more of a it's more of a public thing, I think. I feel more lonely in public spaces. I feel way more lonely at a party than I do at home. Because at least when I come home, I have the comfort of my own space. Even the things in my house feel mine. It's not as much ownership as much as it's just the idea that this is mine, and this is home, and it feels like I've built that for myself.
Sonia talks about one of the core ways in which loneliness is very different from being alone. And, loneliness, simply put, is that absence of social relations or a lack of affection in your existing social relationships. And, in a survey that we'd conducted on loneliness, people wrote back and describing their experiences, and it went from things like, the inability to connect or engage with others to, a lack of being witnessed and being seen to, feeling a lack of companionship or unsupported. And like all of these things were sort of the cumulative voice of their experience of loneliness.
Yeah, those definitions really, people were so articulate and poignant in the way they described it. And I think, city is a very unique context which is very specially capable of magnifying this feeling of lost connections, because nowhere else are you actually surrounded by that many people, right? Cities like Mumbai is one of the densest cities in the world. I was just really astounded to read that it has a population density of 32,300 plus people per square kilometer. That's just, it's insane.
And true.
Yes.
But yeah, and that density also sometimes creates a sense of invisibility, right? Even though you're amongst the throngs of people. And Sonia was actually recalling an incident where she described something that happened to her mother years ago.
And I remember my mum telling me this about living in Bombay. She used to live in a small town. She used to live in Nasik. And then she moved to Bombay after she got married. So for her, this was ridiculous. She's like, I fell on the road. She fell on the road once when she was in her 8th month of pregnancy. She was pregnant with me. And she fell on the road and no one picked her up. And she's like, she still tells me, she said, that moment I was so mad because I was just here and I was so helpless and I felt so lonely. And that day I just cried all the way back home because I felt as if there was legit no one I could reach out to. And that is something I completely understand.
Sonia's also talking about one of her experiences of being really upset and crying on a local train and just how she felt in that moment.
I was still in a ladies' compartment where women asked me once or twice, are you okay? Because I was very visibly upset. But I think that's a boundary that people in cities don't cross. They allow you to have that moment because we live in areas where there is such little space to be yourself, to have that time to grieve, to have that time to process, that we realize that that's a boundary we shouldn't be crossing, and we let people grieve on trains. You'll see a lot of women crying on trains. And you can imagine those situations, but that's a boundary that you don't cross. And I think cities that way can make you feel very, very lonely.
So there is this constant tension in cities, isn't there? I mean, there is on the one side the joy of embracing anonymity, which allows you to express yourself individually better or know yourself individually. But yet, on the other side, on days when you're feeling vulnerable, it can make you feel really, really tiny and small and insignificant. And I lived in Mumbai, and I remember how common it was that I saw people crying in gardens while on walks around the city. In fact, this experience is so common in Mumbai, but because, this movie called Gully Boy, I think I mentioned this to you. I mean, it has this song called Kitni Duri where he actually says, अब देखो तो हम पास हैं लेकिन सोचो कितनी दूरी है. And he's driving this car in which a girl is weeping, and he finds himself barricaded out of the ability to comfort her or reach out to her.
It's actually one of the first things you mentioned to me after you watched the film. I remember that. And that's class, right? Like right there, that there's that unspoken barrier that you can never cross. And everybody knows the rules of the game. And he's that driver, and there's therefore that inherent distance with whoever's traveling in that car. And all the early narratives around mental health and wellness have always put this very strong emphasis on the individual and it being biological and being a personal problem. And sure, in some ways it is, but there's so much more to it than that, because it's all affected by the places we inhabit and our social circumstances, the people we can access for support or not, just the physical environments that we live in and how harsh or easy they are, and all of that determines boundaries also that you can cross and or not cross, and therefore affecting your mental health every single day.
Yeah, and I like how you're putting that, because in this situation particularly, right? I mean, class isn't a material wall. It's not real. But it might as well be, because it is stopping someone from the ability of reaching out, being, part of their support system, and it isolates us. And in very similar ways, other criteria like age, gender, caste, disability even, or generation gaps, illnesses, all of these can be barriers to connection.
Yeah, and in fact, Sonia was talking about just how navigating a city, getting from one place to another amplifies loneliness because of everything it involves. And, it's just so difficult and just everyone's so busy.
Again, this loneliness can strike you most in public spaces. And I feel cities don't have that space for support because everyone's so busy traveling, everyone's so busy working, everyone's so busy then coping with the side effects of traveling and working that we don't think of creating spaces for support, and that's the tragedy of it.
This being too busy traveling and working, as Sonia puts it, these are all parts of modern life that I think we've all embraced. So it was also something Sandhya connected to. But what I found interesting was that she approached it from the perspective of the structure and form of the city itself, where she spoke to how the urban sprawl, the architecture of the city, the public transportation systems, traffic, roads, all of it plays a role in how we as people end up feeling.
The architecture of a city makes a big difference to how people interact with that city. For me, the loneliness in a city, in this city particularly, comes down to the fact that I will think for 2 weeks before I visit my friend in Malaysia. I do not want to get stuck in traffic for 1 hour, 20 minutes, which is what happens. I can only do one thing in one day in Bangalore. And for a long time, I blamed that on myself. So then it could be a function of the fact that I don't get out a lot because the way the city is really. If it's raining, 10 kilometers is anywhere between 1 hour, 45 minutes and 3 hours, right? And I don't want to do that really. It's just, I think of the petrol, I think of the stress I feel just yelling at people around me, being yelled at in turn.
She was talking about how she felt that we were breeding loneliness even in our children, because the same problem of long commutes comes up with them.
So actually the city gets in the way of them interacting with each other, where you could, walk 5 minutes down the street and visit your friend when we were children. it's a different world. They're not even comparable. But these things add to a certain loneliness, right? And that's my biggest problem with this city, that it does not allow you to be warm. It just doesn't in so many ways.
So we laughed about this because it had also taken me about an hour and a half to make a journey of 7 kilometers to come meet her that day. I mean, it was ridiculous. And I think anyone who lives in Bangalore knows this for a fact that, you can't just make a sudden plan to meet your best friend across the city. You can't just zip around. Because, I mean, unless they literally live in your neighborhood. And going anywhere often for me, for sure, is like this exercise in event planning and management every single time.
Yeah, but that's true for all big cities now, not just
true,
Bangalore.
That's true.
And yeah, as you're saying, that commuting and navigating becomes so all-consuming and exhausting that, you actually don't have the energy to do anything else. And I remember a long time ago reading some research which said that commuting can be more stressful than flying a fighter plane, which is just bizarre. But yeah, I think, when you can't do something with ease, then automatically, like you're saying, those social connections that you would maintain before just falls away because it takes so much more effort to do that.
The loneliness bit hits when I realize what I lose when I don't have that physical sort of presence when I'm talking to a good friend. Your body betrays so much, right? Sometimes when someone says something, even a person you really like, if they say something that makes you uncomfortable, either your shoulders tense or your face shuts down a little or your leg moves a little. And all these are signs of discomfort that you totally miss when you're chatting on the phone. And I in that sense, I sort of feel like I've dulled my skills of picking up nonverbal cues. I don't know if it's just me being me, or is it the fact that so much of my conversation happens on the phone and so little in face to face that I miss these things, or at least they're rusty.
So Sandhya expanded on this further through this experience she had of changing neighborhoods and how that led to a change in the interaction she had with the people living around her and what it meant for her.
I'll give you a small and quick example of it. In the earlier place that I used to stay, the general income level was very high. It was my parents' house, and people around there were a lot older than I am, so different space in life in terms of what they were earning and what their priorities were and all of that. So very different from me. I hardly saw my neighbors. I moved here a year ago, and there's a neighbor there, and for a year now we've been exchanging food. And it just feels, whenever I make something, because there's a young boy there and there are old parents there, and I'm like, oh, you know what, let me share. And then it's just the nicest feeling, and the kids love doing it, but the way that's softened me up in terms of just that small action of sharing is just completely softened me up in so many ways. I can see the difference from being hard and, protective about privacy, which is important and I'm never going to deny that you shouldn't be protecting your privacy, but your space, sometimes you can protect your space so much that you're just left alone.
That's really beautifully put. And, Olivia Lang states in The Lonely City, loneliness is difficult to confess, difficult to categorize. Like depression, a state with which it often intersects, it can run deep in the fabric of a person, as much a part of one's being as laughing easily or having red hair. In many ways, what she's saying, like Sandhya, is that at some level we've grown so used to loneliness. It's just a part of our everyday lives. It's a habit almost, and so much so that we're all we're at a point where we're not even thinking about how to change that story or how to challenge it, and and that has such a direct impact on mental well-being and how you're feeling.
I think loneliness is such a huge threat to our survival not as an individual, but just the psyche of humanity. It's actually death, because we're social animals, and I hate using these words, but it is what we are. We are social people, and when loneliness hits, it's a huge existential threat to us. I think one of the biggest reasons we find ways to survive is because we've got friends who understand why your survival is at threat.
I was thinking how, in some ways, loneliness is part of the human experience, or like some would say human condition. I mean, it's like how you experience joy and sadness. I think all of us have these experiences of loneliness at some point or the other in our lives. Yet, I think the nature of loneliness that we're speaking of right now, the scale and constancy, which is kind of being observed right now, it's really startling. And like Sandhya's saying, it's beginning to feel like a crisis that must be addressed at a much higher level than the individual. And I think, these conversations that we've been having on the nature of spaces and places and how they make us feel are important there.
Yeah, and when you talk about, spaces and places, um, and how that increases isolation, I actually remembered, Gurgaon and post the 90s, there was suddenly this big construction boom and all these fancy, very swish office buildings started to come up, and they all had, for the most part, glass fronts. And then there's something about glass that, it feels really hard and distant. And, as posh as they looked, it didn't invite warmth or any kind of support or companionship. It just makes you feel very standoffish, in fact. And, there's research which is not conclusive, but it indicates that people living in high rises actually have a higher degree of isolation. And, in contrast to that, Sonia was talking about how access to nature-based spaces and like public spaces are so vital to to how you feel and to your well-being. And she was saying that going to the beach has become an integral part of her own wellness mechanisms and systems.
I was having a terrible mental health day before yesterday, and the only thing I could think of after napping for 6 hours was, I just want to go to the beach. I just want to stand by the sea. No one interrupted me. There was tourists and families or whatever doing their thing in the background, but I was just there. I stood by the sea for an hour and I came back home and I was fine.
So, this reminds me of those lines by Rilke. And he says, "When anxious, uneasy, and bad thoughts come, I go to the sea, and the sea drowns them out with its great wide sounds, cleanses me with its noise, and imposes a rhythm upon everything in me that is bewildered and confused."
I was nodding along as you were reading that out because the ocean is something I turn to so often myself. And, I think that's why, despite also the mayhem and chaos of Bombay, it works because of the ocean around it.
Yeah, and I think in the way that the ocean is inseparable from Mumbai, gardens are inseparable from Bangalore. And Sandhya spoke to this.
We're hugely lucky in having a Cubbon and a Lalbagh to us. No one talks about this enough, but the smaller areas like a BTM or a JP Nagar or an HSR layout or an Indira Nagar have little parks, right? Little public parks. We take it for granted. We don't talk about it. I mean, all these young 25-year-olds in Bangalore who are complaining about no green spaces just go to the park. It's great.
And even while she was talking about this, I remember reading how WHO emphasizes the need to have urban green spaces, just because, nature has now proven to have benefits that are, both in the arena of mental and physical well-being. And I love how often we've now started saying, that human beings are social animals. We need to acknowledge that. But I think we also need to acknowledge this truth that we are very much animals within an ecosystem. So nature is really important to us. But, tell me this. Did technology and the internet come up in your conversation with Sonia? Because I think it's evident that tech is in the mix somewhere in the space of human connection in the modern age.
Yeah, Sonia is a huge internet enthusiast, and it's also how she accesses support systems, in her life.
I have like my 5 best friends and my parents. Even if someone's not in the city, I think that way being on the internet has made life so easy. I just have to pick up my phone and be like, you know what? I feel like crap. And I want to talk to someone. I don't know why I feel this way. I just want to talk.
So she was talking about how online spaces help her navigate, the largeness of the city, and it's the tool she uses to reach out to like-minded people as well.
Through Twitter and through Instagram, I have found people who live in the same city, who probably are also awkward, depressed, anxious, do not like social situations. So I'm like, okay, you know what? Let's hang. It's chill. Let's hang one on one. We don't have to call 5 people or 6 people to hang out. It can just be a plan we make together.
So this was something Sandhya referred to as well, and hinted at how the internet, interestingly, mirrors the city, as in, it's also a bunch of strangers trying to come together to form a community.
And this whole thing about strangers forming a community, that's what we see online, right? I remember the first time I reached out to a stranger and poured my heart out online. It was in the days of ICQ. I don't know if you remember. I mean, I poured my heart out to someone I just didn't know. And the seamless transition from being mistrustful of strangers, which is what we grow up with, to strangers becoming your community, that's happened for me in the last 15 years because of being online, right? These are people you choose.
Yet, even as she loves her online community and she shared her gratitude for it, Sandhya also pointed out how it's a precarious thing, and what preoccupation with online worlds on mobile phones is doing to all of us.
And finally, I think the final loneliness as a city that I feel is because we're not looking up from our phones. In a cab ride, on a bus ride, on the metro. I remember on the Bombay local trains, you'll have fisherwomen, you'll have vegetable vendors, all of them taking the local train with you. And just their weary expressions or their cheerful expressions, right? All kinds of vendors. Some of them are just bright and happy. And I'm like, you don't have even half the privileges that I have. What is making you this bright? What is making you this happy? And then you start to imagine their lives and you start to imagine everything that may go. And it's great, right? You can imagine either way. You can imagine a completely tragic life for them, or you can imagine a nice, small, simple, but happy life for them. That skill is just gone. And when you stop noticing those things, and this is actually, when you're talking loneliness, this is the biggest thing for me. When you stop noticing these things, you stop empathizing with those lives.
I really resonate with what she's saying. I mean, network technology is a tricky business because in so many ways, it allows for access to people and communities beyond the ones that you inherited. And like people who just open up new worlds for us in so many ways. And in other ways also that contact with family and friends that you might lose otherwise because they're scattered all over the world. But, you can do that video call and see their faces. But the thing with it is it's not a replacement for that intimacy of physicality, right? So that in the absence of touch and feel, a grandparent can't sit with their grandchild on their lap and, you can't feed them lunch or go for a walk to the park. So all those smaller nuances and intimacies that come with it, that becomes absent. And it's that dichotomy between what it allows for and then what is taken away.
And I think in the same way, it's also true of being present in public spaces like Sandhya says. And I think what I really also liked was this additional point that she made about how loss of empathy is also a costly loss of perspective. Because in many ways, when you're on the street or in public spaces, it's one of those few times when you're amidst a variety of people, a whole different set of people than you'd usually be. Because otherwise, we're often enclosed in environments where you have people who very much like you, they have the same histories, they're living the same lifestyles.
We live among people who earn like us. Another way empathy dies, because then we have empathy only for the problems like us. And this is only in cities, and in Bangalore, forget Bombay, you see a lot more. But in Bangalore, everyone restricts ourselves to this sort of environment where we earn, where we live in the same income gap as every income group as everyone else.
Yeah, and like Sandhya says, it's almost like being in a fishbowl, right? And I remember how I began paying attention to the sheer diversity of Mumbai when I was working with an NGO and began visiting and meeting people from very different communities. And, it changed my understanding and perspective, not just of their lives, but about my own life and my own experience.
And I think in that way, the conversation today has indicated that, yes, of course, individual situations matter where the experience of loneliness is concerned. But the nature of the world in terms of the communities and ecosystems we inhabit also matter. There's a dance of just so many variables in there, right? And in fact, the psychosocial approach, as it's called, where you understand an individual in connection with their environment, interpersonal relationships, community, and cultural practices, is increasingly becoming the approach taken by mental health professionals.
Yeah, and that's why when you're talking about solutions or looking at how to address issues of loneliness in the city, it requires interventions at multiple levels because there isn't one answer, right? You have to look at city design and planning, commuting systems, transportation, things like access to housing, drinking water, safety. I mean, all of that is as important as saying I can access a counselor or, access medical support facilities who, can actually care for my well-being. It's all one happy interconnected system.
Yeah, and I think, the danger of someone, taking away this idea that we're somehow critiquing cities and calling them bad. I just want to address that because, this is not to say cities are all bad at all. I think we're all attracted to cities. Cities, because of the possibilities they hold, cities are melting pots where, people from such a variety of cultures and spaces come in. And you and I have grown up in cities and we call them our homes and we love them deeply. And I think that's where the questions take us.
And I think that's why also we're asking ourselves this question, right? Like, where do you want the city to go if you want well-being to improve both individually but also as a community? And, just to circle back to Olivia Lang, and she says, loneliness is personal and it is also political. Loneliness is collective. It is a city. As to how to inhabit it, there are no rules, and nor is there any need to feel shame. Only to remember that the pursuit of individual happiness does not trump or excuse our obligations to each other. We're in this together, this accumulation of scars, this world of objects, this physical and temporary heaven that so often takes on the countenance of hell. What matters is kindness. What matters is solidarity. If you are lonely or in distress and want to access support or help, do look up the resources we have put up on our website. There you can also learn more about how the issue of loneliness in cities is understood and being tackled. Our website is www.thecuriositycollective.org. If you found this conversation interesting, do share it with your friends and communities. In our next conversation, we'll be talking to Aparna and Tanuja from Initiating Concern for All, or ICOL. It's a pioneering mental health project started in 2012 by the School of Human Ecology, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Listen in to hear how we can understand the nature and kinds of distress experienced by individuals in the city and what can be done about it. This episode has been made with the support of Srinidhi Raghavan and produced by the Bangalore Recording Company.